This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Wheels of a Delta 88 spin fast on winter-ravaged upstate roadways. Fallow fields half-encrusted in snow, the rest furrowed in frozen field rot and iced-over mud, unfurl themselves on either side of a moonlit ridge. Spent barns bending under a zillion stars. Homey yellow dash lights and a large speedometer with its needle moving quickly right and left. The lemon moon waning. Clocko heading east into the Catskills terrain he had known since he was a boy, riding in the back seat, pretending to be asleep as his dad, all grunts and groans, negated everything his ma said. His younger brother, Gerard, took the place of Pa in Ma's eyes. He always gave her what she wanted, what she needed, until he left the picture too early. Far too early. There was a comfort to this landscape, especially in the dark when it matched his dreams, and not just his guilt at never having measured up. The Oldsmobile purred through sleeping hamlets and villages lit by scattered street lamps dimmed by dead bugs, ringed with winter's dirt crust. Clocko made sure to stick within the speed limit, on the upper side. The stiff-necked, rail-thin, scraggly-bearded driver took in all he passed. Empty storefronts, boarded-up boarding houses with scattered appliances on multiple porches. Street lots centered by corrugated metal storage sheds and dark homes, some asbestos or vinyl-sided, some peeling paint and emitting the flickering blue light of unwatched late-night television talk shows. The occasional brightly lit soda pop machine or convenience store. Dying fluorescents skittering their way back to black. The sad, endless look of late winter, early spring on the edge of the Catskills. Clocko ejected the big pink tape he'd been playing for days and surrounded himself with strumming guitars and harmonized male voices. The Everly Brothers on lush 8-track. Let It Be Me split into halves, connected by a whir and a click and another whir, accompanied always by this great fan's breath singing, whistles and hums and an occasional word or two at a half pace behind the song. On the passenger side of the wide blanketed front seat was an apple crate of worn tapes, Grateful Deads and Solo Garcias, Beatles and Beach Boys, Creedence and Elvis and Roy Orbison, even Frank Sinatra. Sicilian folk songs Clocko could only phonetically mouth the words to. Strange 10 cents a shot jazz tapes without covers. He cranked the music high and pushed the bass tones, the treble. The whiteness of the road's edge lit swatches of forest cut into by modular homesteading. Old lawn ornaments and picnic tables, battered, frontless mailboxes of all ages and dentedness. An endless rope of sagging, pole-hung telephone and electric wires, echoing the center white and yellow lines, straights, dots, and dashes. Clocko, back in his normal driving mind, flashed back to other journeys at other ages and times. Gerard in the front seat between Ma and Pa on night drives home from his mom's uncle's farm up in Washington County. Clocko stretched out on the back seat under the blanket he now sat on, watching the night sky stay steady above the car, above the entire world they passed through fast and fleetingly. All dead now, except Pa. Clocko passed the time during those drives or when left at home with counting, wishing, yearning games that used the cracks in roadways, the alphabet letters in directional signs and advertisements, cows and sheep and front yard chickens, the patterns on peeling wallpaper and the floor's cracked linoleum, alongside his own limited way with numbers. A cracked barn equaled Uncle Artie's farm. 3 sevens and his mother and brother ended up in heaven. He imagined the happiness of blue-lit homes in small towns, watched kids playing on tire swings, walking with bent twig fishing poles down back roads, sliding down long edge-of-town fields on runner sleds or trash can lids. If at home, he'd remember his imaginings from the road. Breathe in, breathe out. The moon rolled up over a distant hill, backlighting road signs and telephone poles and distant trees in a hollow. Clocko turned off the headlights and whooshed on through the ice-edged, equinox-approaching night in the direction of the slow-rolling lemon moon, careening down rural backroads with the force of all memory, hope, and yearning pushing him onward. Should he U-turn back home or sit the night out at Sid's Ford? He could wait for the dawn light to strike his beloved lady's windows, to climb across her far wall and kiss her sweet eyes awake. He could then open his car door as she opened her front door on that porch he knew so well, could watch lovingly as she stepped out onto the road without looking in either direction, to come to his long-closed, now open arms to say, if only with eyes and spirit and heart, "It's all right. Come to me now, as I've come to you. The time's ours, dear. It's our time." Clocko thought of all those songs that are so good you can't help but stop them halfway through, to start them all over again, to hear them better, to not miss any of it with one's meandering mind. Somewhere behind him, a car crested the hill as he drove lightless. He turned his own beams back on. A cluster of mobile homes appeared to his left. A plywood school bus stop to the right. A faint orange glow emanated from behind a hill. He knew this town, knew that in its center was an all-night gas station, nestled into a corner, where someone would say hi and nod matter-of-factly in his direction. "I want my own memories now," Clocko muttered, while putting a new 8-track in the player. "I want my own story, finally." All around him surged the sound of the band's Music from Big Pink, and his soul's doppelganger, Richard Manuel, singing about his own father, his own tears of rage. "They'll be getting up right around now. Jessie Ketchup's what people call her. She put ketchup on everything back in kindergarten, back in Sunday school, you name it. Some say it was to make up for her dad being gone and all, raised by just her mom. Jessie Ketchup's true as heaven, truer than hell. Pretty girl she is, too, real pretty." Sid Ford's talking a mile a minute as I turn back towards the sun. I slip on my shades. Don't want him to see the yellow in my eyes. An old car starts to pull in as we stand there, Sid talking and me listening. But it quickly U-turned and headed back the way it had come, squishing slugs as it went. The old man shook his head and opened his mouth as if to tell me a whole new story related to the green Oldsmobile and its driver. "What's with all these slugs?" I ask, unable to keep my eyes off the slimy exodus going on as the day warmed to something more than the usual thaw, as if a door to Hades had been ripped open. Some had made it to the highway's double yellow line as if trying to escape the fate of what remained in the road edge's shrinking soot snow patches. They do that every once in a while. Gets really bad in summer, and occasionally during one of these early thaws. Never seen it quite like this, Sid explains, starting into a long description about why slugs crawl onto asphalt in the first place. A natural death wish, like porcupines licking the bottoms of cars, getting after the sweetness of transmission fluid, or gnawing on houses painted with toxic paint. Looking at his oil-blackened hands, then up and over his shoulder towards the open bays of his garage, I'm hit with memories of my pa, Ed. I'm a slug. What have I done with my life? I've been a fool, and worse, a dangerous fool. I hate it all. Mickey Twist and Jim Morrison, Bob Dylan and my place in the band, Beatles and Stones, all the music. I hate rock and roll and what it has done to us. I hate this fucking geezer yapping at me in a high-pitched monotone about goddamn slugs. I've fucked it all up, but good. I remember the look on Liz's face when she first met Mickey Twist, looking on him the way I'm looking at these slugs. Twist in a Jag, all smooth and talking just to her, all misters and ma'ams, beside the Woodstock Village Green. sun just perfect on bright October leaves, and she gripping my hand in hers, her other hand on her pregnant tummy. It was good she didn't see my look, like the one I'd just given the ketchup girl. She'd have slapped me upside the head, then left me. But maybe she did see. We had talked. I told her Mickey was with the record company, A&R, artists and something or other. He in sympathy, Twist said with a smile, shaking our hands and scooting away. Is there a payphone? I interrupt Sid Ford. He says no, but if I can keep it local, he'd let me use his. Woodstock's all, I say. Got to check on my wife and boy. I walk into the station's crowded office, eyes open for a phone amongst the parts catalogs, calendars, pieces of this and that, and newspapers. When I spot a cord, I follow it under a copy of the Woodstock Times, not yet yellowed like everything else in the room. The phone's old style, heavily rooted to the desk. I try Liz's number. Busy. I try again, just in case I got it wrong the first time. It just rings, unanswered. Same thing happens a third time, and then, on the fourth, it starts going busy again. At least I'm no longer getting people treating me as dead air or some odd, unimportant ghost calling in from the other side. That's it, she told me, a year or two into the routine that resulted from Twist's presence in town. I'll restart my career, move back to my parents with the kid, make it in Woodstock on my own if I have to. Like hell, I said, raising my fist in the doorway. That's my kid. You're my wife. She slammed the door and locked it. How could I have ever explained that I just wanted to hit myself? And so she left. The first time. A second time, too. Jessie Ketchup comes across the road from her front porch as I'm on the phone. She's leaning against my car, speaking with Sid. She wears capris and a Hello Kitty muscle shirt. The chill air lends her flesh goosebumps. Small nipples scream howdy. There's something familiar about her, just as there's been something familiar about everything these past days. Missy here says she has a question for you, Sid says as I approach. You get your wife and kid on the line? I shake my head, looking out at the slick of slug guts, the sun catching it just so. At the mention of wife, the teen girl seductively raises a red sparkle-toed foot to scratch behind her calf and pouts. I seen you somewhere? The girl asks. You been parking out here across from my window, mister. Or are you just famous or something? Sid laughs and shakes his head, moving to open his bays. Kids, he mutters. She asks this of every guy who pops through. Jessie Ketchup reminds me a bit of Dawn. It's her attitude, that saucy way she has. A bad girl looking for a bad boy. Didn't you hear me ask you a question, mister? The girl asks louder, pushing her hands back a bit on the car door so her tits point my direction. You as bad as them slugs. I got a good-looking boy almost your age, I say. You be careful now. Listen, I'm sorry about Jessie, but she being... Sid's saying. I wave a hand and tell him he forgot to ask for money. Oh, I figured you'd just be having a credit card, and I can't take credit cards, he answered. But you being from Woodstock and all, you'll be getting back to me. Do you hear about... Thank you, Sid, I interrupt, before he can launch another diatribe. Listen, I was wondering if you had finished that Woodstock Times in there. If so, would it be... Oh, that's a humdinger of an issue. Just out yesterday. Already read it cover to cover, I did. He scampered back inside and reappeared with the newspaper before finishing his sentence. Sid, you're a good man, I said, as I took the paper from him. I was close to home now. I had a lot of questions that needed real answers.
That was Overlook, written by Paul Smart and narrated by Brent Robertson. This is an excerpt from the novel Overlook by Paul Smart, Recital Publishing, 2023.
Hello, Paul, and welcome to the Strange Recital.
Hey, Brent, it's great to hear from you. And Tom, it's a strange way to meet, but at least we're meeting finally.
Yeah, a digital encounter. Better than nothing, right? Now, I know you live in Mexico, so I hope we're not expected to conduct this interview in Spanish.
It would actually be kind of fun to do this in Spanish, but I haven't yet learned how to speak Spanish.
Nor have I. Let's talk about your new novel, Overlook. It has the subtitle, A Rock and Roll Fable. Why is that? Give us a short summary of the book.
Overlook was an attempt to play off of several themes that had caught my attention over the years that I was doing journalism here in the Catskills. On the one hand, there was the whole rock and roll theme involving the tragedy of Richard Manuel's suicide while on a reunion tour down in Florida. And that became mashed together with this other theme that I had been playing with of an itinerant backwoods music fan, shy as can be, who just drives for his own solace. The book follows these two characters, one trying to get home to a Woodstock where he felt whole and where his talents came to fruition, Richard Manuel, and the other being this character, Richie or Clocko, who's just trying to find a place for his own soul to feel safe. The two intersect in various different ways, and there's a lot of scenery in the whole thing and a lot of driving. As for the whole idea of it being a fable, a rock and roll fable, years ago I wrote a nonfiction book about rock and roll in Woodstock, and I covered it quite a bit. And one of the things I learned is that it's a fabulous history.
Yeah.
It's very hard to differentiate the myth from the reality of what was going on. And it's a question whether it really matters, because rock and roll is something that's about fandom as much as anything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also something that seems to be fading away at this point. It's becoming part of our past. And so the idea of calling it a rock and roll fable was a way of separating the book from any factual elements that I was using in it. Rock and roll is a landscape of intuition.
Well, we've heard that the novel was mostly drafted in a small cabin in the Catskill Mountains. Tell us about that.
The way this whole novel came about was that I had gotten a residency at the Platte Clove Cabin, which was this wonderful artist retreat that was run by the Catskill Center for Conservation and Development. It's a one-bedroom cabin that doesn't have any running water. It's a very magical place. And I had a week and I mashed together two projects that I had been mulling in my head for many years. And put them together and wrote the book in a matter of a week. When I got to the end of the whole thing, I stood up and passed out, basically, and came to with nibble marks on my pinky, which I took to be the signs that some small mouse in the place had given me a sign of approval.
Tastes good. Well, this excerpt we just heard is actually made up of two different chapters. Chapter 4 near the beginning and Chapter 19 more than halfway through. Maybe you wanted to highlight the way you use first person and third person to differentiate the two main characters. Is that right?
The strange thing about the first person and third person elements of this manuscript, with the Richard Manuel being in first person and the Clocko sections being in third person, was that at one point they were reversed, and changing all of that in a deeper draft of the whole thing was like turning around a steamship in a Catskill Creek. It was a daunting process, but it clarified what was going on. I wanted to play with the internal logic and narcissism that is inherent in all rock and roll writing and stardom, etc. And I wanted Clocko to be lost in himself. He could never find who he was, and it's not until the end of the script that he really starts to talk in the form of an eye.
There's a lot of driving in this book. Manuel, I keep wanting to say Manuel, but Manuel's driving up from Florida to Woodstock, and Clocko's driving all over the Catskills and even into New Jersey. In my view, that's a uniquely American quality. The cars and highways and backroads are almost like characters.
Not only is driving the standard American meme, it's just embedded in any life one lives in the Catskills or Hudson Valley. I mean, the Hudson Valley, you don't drive quite as much, but when you're deep in the Catskills, you don't have a whole lot of routes to go back and forth on. So you end up retraveling the same ways over and over again. They become embedded in your soul. And then as you get farther away from the deep Catskills, Woodstocks and Shandakens, Olives, you get into the lands of endless backroads. You also get into these areas where all the towns are variations on each other. East Meredith, Central Meredith, South Courtright, Old Courtright, you name it. So I wanted to capture that sense. And I've also, as a roving peripatetic journalist who, in addition to writing for the Woodstock Times, I ran a paper called the Mountain Eagle that covered 5 different counties, and I would try to hit all 5 counties each week. That took me everywhere around the Catskills.
Oh, yes, I know what you mean. Now, I'm going to venture a guess that your story, its mood and settings and people, is connected to Greil Marcus's nonfiction book, The Old Weird America, which digs deep into the music Dylan and the band were making in the basement of Big Pink in 1967. Can you say something about that?
Well, Brent, that's a great supposition, but unfortunately, I haven't read that much Greil Marcus. Years ago, I read some of his stuff, and I really followed him when he was writing for Rolling Stone, and I had the dream, as many young men and women in America did, of becoming a paid rock critic for life. Of course, that's another field like local journalism that kind of has fallen by the wayside.
Yeah.
What I did pull was from just the ethos around rock and roll in the mountains that I had researched heavily when I was working at the Woodstock Times, and that came out in my 1994 book, Rock and Woodstock, which looked into the whole idea of woodshedding pretty deeply, the results of these young, wild men trying to settle down in cabins in the mountains and becoming creative and a little bit older than they actually were in their outlooks. There's a mythic quality to what Robbie Robertson and Richard Manuel and Dylan himself were writing. These are young dudes espousing an age-old wisdom that's not exactly true, but it has proven lasting in many ways. So you take somebody and you throw them into the midst of an old, weird America, and you're going to get something happening.
Yeah. I know people are still making a pilgrimage to Big Pink after 50 years. I played there myself once. The acoustics were fantastic. I put it down to the unfinished ceiling.
Cool. It's owned by a friend of mine, and I hung out in the basement to hear his band play once, long ago. Nowadays, it's a short-term rental.
The only times I was at Big Pink, besides taking people to see the outside of the place, was years ago when a well-known rock and roll, he was a classical music writer, and he had a mail order, one of the early mail order businesses. And so the whole basement at that point was just filled with albums, most of them classical. And a friend of mine, two fellow writers from the Woodstock Times, this was in the late 80s, early 90s, were living upstairs, and they had a child and was raising the child. And you sort of see a flash of that image of Big Pink in Overlook.
Well, around Woodstock, it's hard not to brush up against someone from the rock world occasionally. During your years as a regional journalist, which I imagine were after Richard Manuel's death, did you meet other members of the band?
I got to know Rick Danko a little bit. And also Garth, I got to know a little bit, eating clam strips with him at the old Hojo's down on Route 28 at one point.
Wow.
As for Levon, he became very public during his latter years, and I got to the barn and saw him play a couple times, but for all his public character, I never got to know him that well. I got to know his various managers and the like.
So back to the excerpt. We learn about Klocko's loner personality, his family, his dreams, and that he's a hardcore music fan. And in the second section, we have slugs all over the road and Manuel remembering somebody sinister from his past named Mickey Twist.
I chose the excerpts from here to try to capture the scope of what I'm working with here. Klocko comes out of a character that some friends of mine and I made up in a number of conversations and began to imagine this character of Klocko. He was important to the narrative just for his interior quality of his mind, the way he kept referring back to a few points in his life. A minuscule worldview that gets widened as he goes along, whereas Richard Manuel's worldview is trying to search through his past to find where things went wrong. And it's a wide past that he's dealing with. That's why I chose as a second excerpt this piece where he's at it's actually a gas station, or used to be a gas station on Route 28 out in Shandaken. And the whole idea of the slugs is a mixture of some actual times where we were just completely overrun with slugs deeper up in the Catskills. But there was one season, I think it was in the early 90s, where there was just a massive amount of squirrel deaths on local highways, including the thruway, where everybody you talked to would be talking about how many squirrels were gone. And working this into the book, it made more sense to work with slugs, which are a little less anthropomorphic than a squirrel, and it's a lot cleaner mess than squirrel guts overtaking a chapter in a fable book like Overlook.
Yeah.
So these two lookalikes almost meet each other in this chapter, but the real meeting gets saved for later. No spoilers about what actually happens, but tell us about this idea of doppelgangers in your story. What inspired it?
You know, the whole idea of the doppelgangers was just something that happened as I melded these two completely disparate stories and characters together. I've always been interested in the idea of doppelgangers, having occasionally seen people that seem to mirror each other. And then after I finished this and was starting to edit this into shape for what you're holding in your hands now, for the book that Recital has published, you know, an odd doppelganger thing happened to me where I started to get reports from friends back in the US. They thought they had seen me on Tinker Street or Rock City Road in Woodstock when at that point I had been in Mexico for a full year. So I'm going to actually see if I can find this guy and have him do my readings for me over the coming months.
Haha, sounds fun. Okay, well, Overlook, a rock and roll fable, is now available in both paperback and Kindle from Amazon, and in paperback from all other booksellers. And it is published by Recital Publishing, I might add. So, Paul, what are you working on now?
I've got a number of projects. The most important right at the moment is that I've started off directing and producing and financing a feature film that I have also written that's based on Don Quixote, but is sort of a documentary of a friend of mine and our friendship over the years. It's called Don Barry, a Quixotic Experiment. And in it, the city I'm living in here, Guanajuato, Mexico, is as large a character as the Don Quixote character. And Sancho Panza has been turned into this beautiful young woman, very talented, who's trying to learn Don Barry's secrets to experimental filmmakers. The other big project I'm working on is a book with Barry Gerson in which he relates his experiments beyond film, where he's been using color LED lights to cure himself of the maladies of aging. That book, Elixir of Life, is currently with my book designer down here, and we'll be printing it here in Mexico with these amazing printers I work with. One of the themes I'm working on in my film is the idea of disruptive landscape. It comes out of both Werner Herzog and Bruce Chatwin, the idea that there are landscapes that we sometimes run into that completely shift the way we look at the world.
Interesting.
Well, good luck with those projects, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, thanks, Paul.
Thanks, guys, so much. It's been a lot of fun, and I'll definitely come back to Woodstock to see you all and do some readings as soon as I can. Bye.
I'm still thinking about slugs.
I actually quite like slugs. I find them distinguished and odd. This is The Strange Recital on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Leckhampton Hill by XJ5000 and Cello Improvisation by Michael Severance. This is episode 23101. I'd just like to say that this is the first time I've been on television.